golf was my life, and I didn't want to give it up. So I went to work.
And remember the name, for at just 9 years of age, Rory McIlroy from Hollywood is following in the steps of his golfing hero, Tiger Woods.
Oh my goodness! Oh, wow! In your life have you seen anything like that?
Sup, golfers? Do you want to swing it really good? I mean really good? Then this guest, a gentleman called Mark Ball, 3D Golf, is worth listening to. His name came up on several of the episodes interviewing other tour players who said perhaps I should reach out to him, and that's exactly what I did. I went out to Reigate Hill Golf Club, where he's based in the UK, and watched him conduct a lesson to one of his students. And it's one of the most fascinating lessons I've ever been taking part in, just watching. And he straps you up to this 3D biomechanical hardware, which then illustrates your skeletal system and how your body moves on a software in front of you in real time. So, for instance, whereas perhaps most teaching pros, it may take 30-40 minutes to find a specific movement that may not be working, for you to find a feeling or quick fix, for you to take away with, that may work on the day but may not be a long-term result. Mark can specifically highlight a movement of the body which that may not be working as effective as perhaps it should be, and then he can actually, with his software, he can then put, say, on the backswing, if your club needs to be slightly outside of your hands, he can put in these beeps and noises where it could be a good sound if you're in the new position, or a bad sound, perhaps where you've returned to your old position. It's this fascinating academic approach to teaching golf without being overcomplicated. In fact, I was fascinated of how little Mark said during a lesson and actually got the student to teach himself. So this is a fascinating interview with Mark, and perhaps something which you may have never come across. So I really hope you enjoy this one. It's another fantastic interview. We touch on what exactly is 3D biomechanics, teaching philosophies, and even a little bit of stoicism. So it's a fantastic episode, and I hope you enjoy. And welcome to Making a Club Champion. Mark Ball, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris, and delighted to talk with you.
Fantastic. So I was very fortunate enough, you fortunate enough to accept my invite to come up and have a look about what you were up to, as your name kept coming up with a couple of guests that I had on the show. And for the listeners out there who don't know perhaps what you do, could you explain a little bit what is biomechanics and a little bit how you teach that?
Yeah, well, biomechanics is a subject, is the application of mechanics to human structure. So essentially kind of how mechanics are applied to humans. But I think there's much more to it than just applying the kind of those basic principles. I think I tend to kind of refer to it more as kind of movement science. So, a good example being, Chris, I might do, say, a workshop for, say, coaches, for example. And you may say to them, okay, what does kind of biomechanics mean to you? And it's kind of staggering in some ways that there may be kind of 50 guys in the room, and often you'll get 50 different replies. So I actually don't use the word, or let me say it again, I actually use the word biomechanics less in lesson sessions now, and just make it more around, movement science, and let's look at how people move, and rather than, I think, although it's a very, very clear subject, obviously what biomechanics is, it can be slightly ambiguous as far as what it means to the end user, in this case, the player or the coach. So I try and keep it slightly more intuitive and just say it's just kind of how you move, and we're applying science to kind of movement systems.
Fantastic. And so why should someone come and see you opposed to, say, a Coventry coach?
Well, typically when someone comes to see me, there's normally very, very defined questions that they have, which they'd like me to kind of resolve and answer, or certainly help them explore. Three of the more common reasons would be, well, someone's in pain. So much of what I do is either around pain avoidance or the kind of rehab of kind of post-injury, post-surgery, whatever it might be. So that's always one of the main priorities, that the avoidance of pain, and really have it, avoiding ever having that discussion, because you move so well that things never became a problem. So much of my kind of movement-based stuff is to actually avoid things ever happening, because you just did a great job way back when. In addition to that, another reason why people come is to really where they can make kind of gains in how they perform. So, gains you can define in many ways. The very tangible gains would be things like, driving distance, improved club delivery. Again, some of the pain stuff, being a lot more variable in the movement. So, for example, regardless of the environment, regardless of the task, for example, can you hit me that shot around the tree, or can you kind of move it from that slope? That they can adapt the way they move to really accommodate any kind of task in the environment. And also, thirdly to that, which kind of makes up much of my work, is to really understand kind of what works and why it works for them. That kind of question really opens up, Chris, defining what good movement is. Or then my reply would actually be, well, does good movement even exist? I mean, it's one of those very, very expansive areas you can explore. So I think much of it is to understand as a human, as an individual, kind of what works and why it works. So defining what's very, very helpful for you. And I think also is of much value, things that the individual needs to avoid doing. So much of my work, again, is around an avoidance approach, that for player A, really just avoid doing this. And that could be very, very different to, say, player B.
Fantastic. So I really threw you the curveball question there of tell me exactly the benefits of your business. But I think when I came up and saw you, there was we were watching a player. Actually, you could say he was going through. He happened to go through the pain stage as he had problems with his back, but was actually a fantastic player and was reaping all the rewards of what you were teaching him. But the thing that really stuck out for me was that you were very, very specific with being able to highlight the key areas for him to work on. So I was wondering if you could talk us through sort of a lesson and the setup and what that initially looks like when a player comes to work with you.
Yeah, so much of that is defined by the client's question in advance. So, occasionally you may get someone come and go, "Hey, Mark, just what's your thoughts? I'm in a bit of a, my game's in a bit of a mess, and my concepts and my thoughts are slightly misguided by stuff." So you may get the odd guy that just goes, "Look, just share your thoughts. What's being fed back, and really, let's just kind of just plot through stuff." But so invariably, people come with a very, very defined question which they'd like me to kind of explore with them.
And that could be sort of in pain, or it could be actually improvement.
Yeah, absolutely right. So it might just be that there's a particular ball flight they're trying to avoid, or one they're trying to encourage. There's certain movements that they find challenging, or movements they're trying to move away from. Pain is another good example. Distance. One of the other big things, which I think it kind of goes back to your first question around defining what biomechanics is. One of my main objectives in most sessions is to try and make people as autonomous as they can. So much of my role is actually around creating non-dependency. So you kind of guide them in such a way that they become non-dependent on you. And that can be quite a skill that, information, people like me that have all this information available, that can actually be a problem, because people become more dependent on the information I have then. So some of the assumptions people have with me is they're going to go and see Mark, and what button are you going to press to make me good today? And that's just so far away from kind of how I do stuff. So much of it is actually around me asking, not so much giving the people answers, but asking them much more provocative and much more expansive questions that helps them explore more as far as the options they have, the choices they can make, and really based on what information they have, what options or what do they best feel they can go and use and play with to add huge value to what they do. So, how is, going back to the second part of that question, how a session looks, I connect them to my system, my 3D motion capture system. The system will feed back in real time what you call joint and segment position and orientation. So in the 3D world, orientation is the rotation which joints move through, and the position is where it is in space as those joints rotate. along things like how do segments interact, or how they match up and move together, the speeds, the accelerations, how you load joints, how tissues are being loaded, that kind of stuff. So all that information is fed back to me pretty much in real time. So I mean, the data is there quicker than I can click and save. That's kind of give you an idea of how, or the lack of latency between when the player moves and when my system detects it. But like I said to all people, the data to a level is irrelevant, Chris. It's more the story behind it, which I'm a lot more intrigued and enthused by. So this is a kind of a common question which I get asked in most sessions. It's kind of, what does the data say? I said, well, the data says nothing. It's just how you and I choose to read it.
Right.
And that's a very, very different way of seeing information. One thing I can certainly assure you that, regardless of the measurement device, whether it be, 3D motion capture or launch monitor or force plates or even stats to a level, the actual information is of no value. What's of significant value is the story behind that information. So in my world, it's how that player moves and the concepts they have and the schemas they have and the backgrounds they have, which had led them to produce that value. So I'm initially a lot more curious to explore those areas and just saying, hey, player A, your pelvis rotated X and it moved in that direction. That doesn't really help. So that's kind of how a session would normally look. And then based on whatever questions they have and certainly based on the information which is being fed back, we can then start to pick through that. To me, to then really set, I kind of look at it two ways, almost set a little priority list. That what's your priority today? So if you had to go and perform today or tomorrow, what one movement can you adjust and improve to really help you go and perform the best you can tomorrow? And then secondly, really, what are the priorities over time? So time might be, as an example, for really what are the priorities throughout 2017? So you get kind of almost two little defined areas. What's your priority today? And I kind of say priority in a very non-plural way. And then what are the priorities over 2017? And then how we start to detect that really comes back to then something I call point of failure versus point of interest. So the point of failure is typically kind of what the player feels or what the coach sees or what the measurement device is feeding back. So that's kind of really where the sensory system or the observations are really kind of being detected. But the point of interest to me is really what's making that segment move that way, or what's making the club behave in that way, or what's making the person receive the feedback in that way. So often by getting better at what's happening over here, you got to get better at what's kind of happening over there. So that's kind of how a session works. And then we kind of plot through awareness and understanding and discussion and, kind of feedback-based drills to really help the player understand their thoughts and understand their feels and get very, very good at themselves at working out what they need to adjust and what they need to adapt to really resolve whatever question is that they came in with at the start of the session.
I guess success is a very vague term, but in regards to the questions they come in with, is there a specific success measure you look out for? Is it on the individual, or is it a sequence that you look throughout all of your students?
I mean, that's again, a very expansive question. There's a very philosophical answer to that question, and there's a slightly more tangible answer to that question. So, the client would define success, not me. It's I'm very big on it. It's their session, not mine. We're here for them, not vice versa.
Their success would be defining their problems, which they come in with, which perhaps you could give them maybe an example of those, maybe.
I would still say, that for me, my most preferred definition of success is the player walks away absolutely clear what they need to play with to solve question X.
Right.
So they walk away and go, I'm absolutely clear, I know what I need to play with, or I know what I need to adjust or avoid. That for me is always success. Because again, that kind of goes back slightly to an expectation setting that people's expectations sometimes can be, I'm going to push a button, they're going to be resolved. And that's just not realistic. Sometimes it may well be, it depends on the individual. So I would say a success is the player walks away absolutely clear of two things: what they need to improve to answer the question that they have, and then they walk away again equally as clear to understand why they were experiencing whatever it was at the start of the session, the movement, the club delivery, the ball flight, the pain, the lack of distance, whatever it might be.
Can you could you give some examples of those sort of questions which a player might come into you with?
Yeah. So I actually had one this morning with a guy that came in. He said he'd been through multiple coaches, good player. And this guy kind of plays kind of local mini tours. Said he's been around a ton of guys in the past. And he's never really been able to resolve why his club delivery moved in the way it did. So kind of just really, picking through the information, kind of exploring his movement history, looking at his learning history in some ways as well. It actually connected back to just really the way he stood. So when we kind of improved and enhanced the way he was standing, mainly around his neck and his upper spine and rib cage, he could instantly connect back that by getting better at standing well, then allowed him to move in such a way that really not only improved the club delivery, but he understood then why he had to do what he was doing in downswing to really move around the start position he had. So he walked away quite clear that actually, the club delivery wasn't the problem. It was how his little GPS, how his brain adapted to his start position to find impact. So by standing better and understanding how his neck was aligned to his upper spine, actually connected back to a few frames on why the club moved in the way it did.
And I guess the benefit of what you do is you can be able to highlight those certain bits or isolate those specific movements maybe, which maybe a coach, like the example of that student, may not be able to pick up on with the use of your software. Is that right? Or
yeah, pretty much that. And I think you got to look at that two ways. That certainly in this generation, that there's many measurement devices which are available to anyone, but it's not the system's actually not that relevant. It's the end user's education. So it will always be the end user's education and experience and know-how. Know-how probably being the most important part here. It's always the end user's know-how, which is more important than the actual system they work with. So an example being, you can have a £1 million system with very, very kind of limited understanding of what the values mean and what's behind the values. Or you could have a very, very kind of low-level system, but a wonderful education, a wonderful understanding of movement, and being able to then understand why even those values they kind of display in the way they do. So that would always be more important. Certainly in this kind of current generation where we become slightly obsessed by information, obsessed by systems, it will always still be the know-how of the end user which is of most value.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something during our time. You said sit down and shut up, or you were born to move and ask questions.
Absolutely right. And I said that slightly humorous, but it's true when you think about stuff, that two of the most wonderful inherent skills that we were kind of fortunately born with was the ability to move and the ability to ask questions. But from the day you're born, really two things have happened. You kind of strapped into a cot and you get a dummy put in your mouth. So almost from day one, parents and teachers, and we're all part of the blame. It's just people. So I'm very much part of that problem as well, that we constrain people by putting things in their mouths and strapping them down, which is kind of young babies.
Right.
And and then we go to school, and often teachers says, "Hey kids, sit down and be quiet." But yet inherently we're born to move and born to ask questions. So, it really opens up a discussion that we are constrained by the environment that we're really kind of encouraged or forced to conform to. And I say that in a fun way. It's all meant in a fun way, that stuff. But humans are designed to move and designed to ask questions.
So is asking better questions of oneself could lead to better results?
For me, absolutely right. And it's all about the question. You could kind of look at it, you could divide that into three areas, kind of what you ask, how you ask it, and when you ask it. And so I think the questions that you ask are absolutely valuable. So I revert back to an earlier comment that remind me or remind anyone, whose session is it? Is it mine or theirs? And I think that's something which kind of many people need to remind themselves sometimes, that it's the client's session, not ours. So two of my kind of favorite questions to players are, how do you want to use your time today? And it's staggering how many people look at you and go silent. Well, that's for me an absolute, essential part of the discussion. And then secondly, I say to the guys, no, initially we have this information. Do you want to see it? Because again, people make the assumption that just because there's information available, the end user may not always want to see it.
Right.
And then secondly, if we have this information, how do you want to use the information? What questions would you like answering?
If, say, the listeners or the golfers or students out there were to get clear on, say, two specific things, what would you encourage them to get clear on?
I would say to understand why they do what they do would always be my first one. So why they have the feels they have, or why they make the moves they do, or why visually they kind of see things in kind of visual feedback.
Is that in terms of the shot they hit, or
just making it more around how they move? So, how they move in a golf swing. So it's to understand why they do and move and visually kind of see what they see. And then secondly, to actually make it a bit about golf now, not so much the kind of thought behind this stuff, just stand well. If you had to guide anyone just to do one thing well, just stand well. And I mean that you could divide that in two ways, anatomically or from a postural kind of structure. Really just have the most wonderful frame that you can, and really, use the frame that mum and dad were very fortunate enough to give you way back when. And, most of the issues I have when people come in, I say at a later life, probably from early teens onwards, their body structures and their postural frames are so adapted and so imbalanced that much of the movement patterns they refine and learn over time are influenced just by the posture that they now have. So if you can kind of look at it two ways, always start to restore and just stand beautifully as an anatomical frame, and then how to apply those that start position, that posture to golf.
So is that just standing non-golf related with good posture?
And absolutely right, and then employing that in golf.
Into golf.
I mean, I could be hugely generic and I'd be a bit dismissive, but it's accurate for most that most things connect back to the postural imbalances people have just in standing, and how they employ or how they stand at addressing golf. So really what they do is that they find ways of making that start position work. So much of what coaches see and in measurement devices feedback and players feel are how they moved around that frame to make it all work. But there's always two slight caveats to that. At what cost and to what level?
Right. And what are the most common problems you see in, say, a postural, without any golf relations?
Really how they sit around the neck and their head, kind of how they sit around the scapula and the upper spine, kind of how they position kind of lower limbs. So mainly just spine awareness, head, neck, pelvis, rib cage is so poor for most people. And that's just life and gravity and occupation and habitual patterns and that stuff. And then in golf, really just having them define what a good spine is in terms of spine placement and good limb attachment, mainly legs and arms and neck, how they attach into that spine are. And you start to kind of, hey guys, just define what good start position is. And that can kind of make you smile in terms of what comes back some days, but that's kind of what makes it fun.
Because there's two sides of what you do, isn't there? There's the 3D biomechanic element, but there's also, you do the sport rehab and exercise. How do you split the sort of time difference between those two with the players you work with?
Yeah, but rehab less so. There's more avoidance than rehab. If I would only really rehab someone if they've had an issue and they've come in to see me for the first time post a problem. Right. So I would say much of my work is more avoidance. That if we do a great job now, we actually never have that discussion in 10 years' time because you did a great job way back when. So in some ways you can't separate. They're all part of a global system. How you move, the concepts you have, the issues that they can create, how that affects skill refinement, how it affects skill development, how it connects into your training. I mean, they're all part of a system. I typically try not to separate, as you say, biomechanics to the human. For me, they're all part of that system. And so I would, and again, the only time I'd really say, look, okay, let's make it hugely around the values if there is a very, very, very precise question that needs to be answered because there's a very, very specific issue that you're trying to resolve. So I think when you get very narrow in that approach, well, let's look at X, you often then miss so much more as to, again, why the person moves in that way. So I think you've got to be a lot more expansive, but sometimes you have to be very, very specific in where you put your attention because there is a very, very, very defined question. And typically that's around if there's been a very, very bad trauma, for example, a stress fracture or an issue somewhere, which you've got to look at, okay, locally, what's happening around that joint, which is clearly causing a lot of irritation. But then in addition to that, globally, how are they moving in what are the thoughts behind that movement that made that joint respond that way.
Say if someone is of good health and good postural standing, in terms of actual swing sequence, what do you look out for in that? Is there a specific sequence to the for an optimized golf swing that you may see between say the top performers in the field of golf?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, the idea of, as you say, sequencing or kinematics or segment interaction, and there's multiple ways of describing the same thing. That's what kind of makes it fun in some ways. So certainly for many years, that's a well-told story, and it's certainly a very well-researched story behind, segmentally, how do those segments interact to best move energy through the segments out to the most distal part, which is either the hand or club head, depending on how you want to see things. So you can look at that kind of two ways. That the very, very deterministic approach is there is an absolutely defined way, and this is probably even not so much deterministic, more around from a physiological discussion. Clearly, there is an advantageous way of moving to best develop kind of distal end, furthest end speed in terms of how the segments move. Undeniably, that's true. But then you look at it more from an independent point of view, that actually how many of those players produce those values. I need to think about this before I give an accurate answer, but off memory, how many of the players that I'm very, very kind of fortunate to be around absolutely achieve those ideal values? 20%, but then how frequent do those 20% produce those values? 20%. So sometimes, there is this, in the world of physiology and biomechanics, absolutely a preferred and advantageous way of segmentally moving to best produce speed and distance. In reality, how frequent does it happen? For every 100 elite players, probably 20 produce absolutely beautiful values that really conform to that concept. How frequently do they do that? Probably 20% of the time again. So sometimes that can create an issue that people often are trying to create movements that they simply just don't exist.
Right.
So I think you look at sequencing as an area. It's been hugely helpful. Undeniably helpful in helping education, helping awareness, and helping really advance and evolve coaching and understanding the movement. But I would look at it much more global than that. That for me, sequencing is the product of how people move. So if you move well, you'll sequence hopefully quite well, rather than trying to say, let's try and improve how you sequence. So for me, it's much more of an outcome value that through wonderful concept, understanding of task, clarity around what you're trying to achieve. So if the task is clear and people are really intuitive and inherent in their movement, invariably you improve their sequencing. Because I think sequencing is a much more deeply innate, deeply intuitive, inherent response to a very clear understanding of what the task is. Not, let's just try and improve our sequence, so a much more explicit approach to perhaps learning.
Can you give an example of that in terms of maybe a player you've worked with?
I can't give names of players,
but
I would say, just by standing better and understanding how you move through, say, wrist and backswing, clearly help them move better in downswing. So they understand that the reason why the sequence was off, not because they were sequencing poorly, it was because of how segments moved in advance of the downswing that made it very demanding and very challenging to sequence well. Or it might be actually really improving someone's concept of movement, that actually by getting better at how you move through backswing actually allows you then to actually move in the way that you were kind of designed to move through downswing. So they start going, okay, I understand then that by getting better at X, actually get better at Y being the sequencing values, not by saying, your rib cage accelerates and peaks before the pelvis in the down, so therefore we've got to get your pelvis moving better. Invariably, that doesn't happen. There's a reason why, where in advance of the sequencing values, that the rib cage moved in the way it did. So I'd be a lot more directed to exploring that approach rather than just saying, hey, player A, accelerate your pelvis sooner.
Right. And would you say that the after impact and thereafter, is that a direct net result of the backswing?
Yeah, and I'd even go in advance of that. I think most things,
It's almost like a mirror of, opposite, isn't it? Of everything that comes sort of after is a net result of what happened before.
Yeah, by the time you see it and we feel it, the imbalance has already happened. That's movement. So the sensory feedback is always the sensory system is always the frame after the actual movement happens. So the minute you would detect it or I would feel it, what we felt was the response to the imbalance that happened before. So when it comes to movement, typically, I think, when it comes to golf, invariably, if you get two things pretty much accurate, you've got to go a long way in the messings up. Those two things being anatomically, if you have all the options available that you're born with, alongside a very, very clear concept of what you're trying to achieve, invariably that solves most problems. If you then invert that, often where many, many issues migrate and originate from, people's frames are so adapted and they become, in a movement definition, they've almost become slightly disabled in their movement because occupation and what they haven't done and types of training they've employed have actually started to reduce the options they have as a human, and all their concepts are slightly misguided through the information they've been around, stuff they've been exposed to, past learning, that kind of stuff. It's almost, in some ways, you start to look at really how beliefs form, that their beliefs and their concepts are so misguided through what they've been exposed to. So then why they do what they do and why they move in the way they do are really an influence of some anatomical adaptations and some, I kind of say, not misguided concepts, but what concepts which clearly aren't helping.
And that could all due result back to their lifestyle and their habits?
I mean, everything goes back to day one. It kind of goes back to kind of sit down and be quiet. That most things that, I'm 43 now, Chris, and most of the things that I'm exposed to in my golf now connect back to my very first exposure of golf back when I was 12.
Right.
About my perception of golf, my initial, almost, I remember well, my very first lesson in some ways, that guided my concept and really set my expectations and beliefs around this is what golf is and this is how golf instruction should be.
So how does someone unravel all of those years of muscle ingraining habits? And I guess the thing I noticed that really impressed me when you were giving that lesson was, when you said that Mark can just play for the beep with our students, but that beep also enabled you to highlight specific problems with a student and then for them to feel or get into a specific slot or area which perhaps they would not be able to have done with maybe a conventional coach. I'm not saying there's benefits or pros of each one, but that was something that really stood out for me, and that you could put those beeps in, say, if you're in a good position where you wanted to be, or actually you're reverting into a bad position.
That's absolutely right. I mean, biofeedback is at school. Biofeedback is mainly used as something I kind of describe as movement awareness or spatial awareness. It depends on how you type to see things. So we can set biofeedback, Chris, as either a very helpful thing or something to be avoided. So I think much of that, goes back to what we said at the start of the discussion. I like to give players options or, certainly give players choices. So an example being, I may say to someone, would you like to make the feedback, the beep today, a good thing or something to avoid? So some people like reinforcement, like encouragement, almost like, yes, that was a good thing. So let's make the beep in this case then play a race, something to kind of aspire towards and kind of move towards, and make it almost, it kind of goes back to your question, how we're going to define success now in the movement world is let's have that beep come on at that point in time. Great. Other players, and again, it really goes back to kind of how players see the world and kind of how they really see movement, is let's try and avoid that beep happening. So you can really adapt and evolve and explore and adjust as you wish, just avoid moving that way to make that beep come on. So you can kind of look at it two ways. Let's use the biofeedback to either encourage a movement or avoid moving that way. And because that happens in real time, essentially what you give is a real time task. Okay, but you may even recall me saying this in the session. I said to the player we had that day, okay, based on what you now know and based on the feedback is now providing, go and achieve this or go and avoid that.
Right. Yeah.
So I think I may have said in the session, if I can recall, based on what you now know, go and make that adjustment. So you hugely give them the autonomy. That, okay, it's something called internal representation. What does that now mean to me? And that's much of what learning is kind of influenced by, is what that meant to you.
Yeah.
Now, the challenge with words and the challenge with discussion, sometimes it needs an interpretation, and that's when it becomes unclear and ambiguous again. So I think where the feedback's very clear is it really allows me to say loads by saying nothing.
Yeah, it was the amazing thing, because it was almost like you weren't giving a lesson. It was the student giving himself the lesson.
Huh?
But you were just sort of that, like an aid that was like giving him the direction to go along.
Yeah, I kind of say it in a fun way. Your role in some ways is to be like a little Sherpa.
Yeah.
Let's kind of hold your hand and climb Everest. And that's really what it is. So my role is not to give them the answer. My role is to really give them more choices and options to play with and explore.
I guess, when you first started out, and, golf coaching is a very competitive industry. Did you always start like that, or were you actually overloading the student with information?
Oh, no, I think I'd be very disappointed if you and I had the same discussion in 12 months, because I've not evolved. And so that's kind of been one of my philosophies since day one, that if we did this discussion tomorrow, I'd like to think I'd say something a little different, because I've expanded my kind of thoughts and understanding by a further day. So, yeah, very much so that my early experiences as a young, aspiring player, and hugely influenced the way I now work with players now. I was a kid that was kind of told to sit down and be quiet, and this is what you need to do. The wonderful word, you need to do this. And I was always taught. I was never given the chance to explore. I was always compared to someone else. This is what, on screen with videos, and this compared to Tiger Woods. But I always thought, I'm not, my hero as a kid was Nick Faldo, but I thought, I'm not Nick Faldo. Nick Faldo is 6'4" and I'm 5'8". So I always thought from day one that why am I being compared to a guy 6'4" and I'm a 12-year-old boy who's 5 foot, whatever was in them days, 5'6", 5'7", and I never understood that. And then I'd ask questions, and I was told, be quiet and go and do it, because that's what you were told to do. So I became very much my environment, but not so much the external environment, more my learning environment.
In terms of biomechanics, is it actually better for the students of the game to sort of look and model themselves after people similar builds to themselves and weights? No,
because you can have the same frame but have a very, very different set of options and ranges available. So you could get someone that's 5'8". I'm, in metric or whatever, 70 kilos, 11 stone, and 5'8". It doesn't mean I've got the same range and the same physiological capabilities as someone else my height and weight. I would say just be the best at being you.
Okay.
Be the best at being Chris Baker. I guarantee no one's better in being Chris Baker than Chris Baker. So let's help you explore what will make Chris the best at being Chris.
And the set of internal questions which, say, someone like myself may have, how can I get specific on those, or what would you like to see in terms of, if I were coming to you for a lesson, that would be best preparing myself for success?
Yeah, I think it's not what I want to see, it's what you want to achieve. I mean, it comes back to, hey, Chris, how can I help today? And so that would be one of my first questions. That if someone is really in a bit of a bit stuck and they say, look, Mark, I just need some help. So, look, I actually had it with a guy in the US recently, and he said, look, I'm in such a mess. I don't need a discussion. I don't need just help me get better at this. Fine. Absolutely, no problem at all. Sometimes you have to employ that approach. He just didn't. And this guy's he actually won on the PGA Tour this year. So he's a very, very good player. He was in such a place in life that he didn't need to understand it. Just tell me what to do. And those guys happen every 1 in 100. So sometimes you have to say, okay, well, based on your concerns and kind of based on what's happening and based on what's about to happen, what one thing can we improve is going to really help you get better at what you do? Cool. Let's go and do that. And but that's always, for me, the kind of last approach you should employ, because when it goes wrong, as it will do again, that's just the way those humans are. You kind of say, okay, so what next? What's next? So they go, they don't really have a what next. So I think much of it is avoiding being in that kind of place in life that, going back to the session you observed a little while ago, that is that young man is now absolutely aware what he does. He's becoming more autonomous as far as why he gets the feels he has, and and what's of value to him and what his priorities, what he needs to avoid, really what makes him perform well. And I think I may have said to this guy, if I recall correctly, I said it will always go wrong on the back line of the Open Championship. That's when things go wrong, or club championship or county, whatever it might be. You can't phone me up and ask me to solve the problem. So a lot of what I do with players is that when they start to detect certain movements or start to become aware of certain concerns, that they have the necessary skills and the necessary awareness to make that improvement instantaneously without having to phone me up. So again, it really goes back to, you coach non-dependency. However, sometimes you have to hold people's hands and just say to someone, just get good at that, because that's more with some of the more established, some of the older guys, and they've been around it for so long, and they are, I'm going to say this in a movement kind of, they're disabled in their thinking. They've lost the ability to think. They've been so de-skilled through information and so de-skilled through their experiences. And I was partly that as a young kid. I actually got de-skilled through coaching as a kid. All the inherent skills that I was fortunate enough to be born with were actually coached out of me through my experiences of coaching. So you have to have that very, I think that just goes back to, you become a far more adaptable and far more flexible coach, I guess, in some ways, if you have more options and more answers to play with. You don't just have an approach, you have multiple approaches.
Fantastic. I want to be respectful for your time, Mark, but I know that most of your would you say that most of your clients or students work alongside you with their own coaches?
Yeah, kind of half and half. So I'll kind of give you my day tomorrow, actually. So the 4 guys I'm seeing tomorrow, 2 have coaches, 2 just come to see me on their own. So it's very diverse in some ways, that often when the coach comes in, it's because they have a very, very defined question which they like to understand more. So again, in a very, very fun, good way, it becomes part player development, part coach education, but in a very good way. So the coach goes, okay, I'm now aware of what the priorities are over time, and that's, the coaches are the best at that. So I'm privileged and blessed. I work alongside hundreds of wonderful coaches, and there are some outstanding coaches out there. And then some guys just come in on their own because they want to understand it more. So, but yeah, much of the time a player will come with their coach, and so I'm fortunate. The coaches are just superb to work alongside, and they actually help educate me because they ask me such wonderful questions to explore. They actually help me get slightly better at what I do, or actually a lot better at what I do, because they demand more from me. And that also applies to the physios, the S&C guys, and anyone involved in players. That I'm actually a big fan that the more people in the room, so the coach, the physio, the trainer, there's actually only really one winner, the player, because they really challenge me more, but in a good way. So if I had 10 people in the room, I'd be happy.
And without naming names, can you give an example of when perhaps a golfer, it could be a good, professional ability, or just a club golfer, has come in with a specific question that perhaps maybe the coach couldn't fix, but you were able to work alongside the coach and work with that together?
Yeah, I actually had 2 today, and the very, very first guy that came in works for the coach. He's actually over from Australia for a week. He's an English guy, but he's based in Australia. His coach was trying to understand why the launch monitor was displaying certain values. So really my role was to understand what was making the club move that way through delivery. So we kind of picked through the information that and actually went back to actually partly how he stood at address, and then partly how he initiated backswing. So again, by standing better, moving better in that first phase in backswing, hugely improved club delivery. So the coach was like, fantastic, great. That really kind of gives me some wonderful guidance to play with over time. And then the second person in today, I think I mentioned earlier, was a guy who was trying to, again, avoid a certain club delivery, but this goes back to more the anatomical body structure stuff. So it's actually more to explore with his physio some better questions as to what's happening around his neck and his head and his upper spine that's created such a real adaptation, which is then made it almost created a constraint through his frame that's made him adapt in the way he moves to then produce that club delivery. So that's a very, very accurate reflection of the first 2 people that I saw this morning.
And then how often would they come and see you again for like a check-in? Because it's such a, I don't think many people, if they've never heard of you, would have sort of experienced a relationship like that with like almost 2 coaches working together.
Yeah. You kind of look at that two ways. Is when they had another question they'd like me to explore with them.
Yeah.
Or just when they want some reassurance or some feedback around what we discussed last time is moving in the direction that they want it to move. And but normally is when they have a different question they like to play with. Right. So I could see someone once a year. I could typically see someone 4 times a year. Some guys like to come in every 3 or 4 weeks. It really depends on much about the human's personality.
Fantastic. I actually spoke to one of your students. I won't name names, but and I sort of was picking up on what regarding how technical perhaps or a lesson could be with you in terms of or it could be feel, but then how he sort of implements that on a course in, say, a competitive environment. But I know you're big on actually getting a player, what would this look or feel like if he had to play like the British boys tomorrow? How does perhaps someone who is maybe very left-brained actually sort of implement sort of very right-brained attitude on the course in a competition mode?
Yeah, not you, Chris. One of my least favourite words is the word technique. I really dislike that. Is movement. We are not techniques. We're movers. So I'd always say to someone, no, we're not looking at the technique you have. We're just looking at how you move today. And to me, it's a very, very different approach. I think that's down to the human again. You look at, again, what you call the internal representation. I might say, look, that the net gain will be the same regardless. You will get the same movement improvement or the same club delivery or the same joint load or the same distance gains or whatever you want to define that as. You will get the same net gain. There's multiple ways we can achieve that. Where do you feel you can best put your attention to achieve this? So let me kind of give you the current options available. So I kind of walk them through. It might be, say, there's 3 ways you can resolve this today. Could be, say, through how you move through hand and arm. Could be more through kind of how the spine moves. Could be more through some external tasks. Okay, so let's look at more some external kind of foci and where we can put our attention more on the outcome movements. So I kind of give them the options and they will decide best on what those options mean to them and which one they can best relate to that best allows them to answer that problem. So again, it's really my role is to give options, not to give an answer. They know inherently. They might go, hand and I don't. Yeah, but I can really connect to that. Cool, we'll go play with that. Because I know that really the options I give them will all connect back to the same net gain, the same end result.
Okay, I know that having watched you give a lesson, I was just blown away by actually how simple the information was you were giving the student, which is it. Almost this interview has been it's been so full on with information. It seems very much how you work with the individual and how specific that is, and how that almost you can't relate it to. You can't almost give this sort of like overall application to every golfer because it's so specific to that individual.
Hugely, I mean, one of my big philosophies is all case studies are one. We all have our unique constraints. We all have our kind of movement options. We all have our ways of seeing the planet. And that's what makes it fun. So for me, everyone's a case study of one. And so based on whatever options you have and whatever constraints that you have, and I'm very big on it. I don't work with skill levels. I work with human beings. And for me, I just see human beings, not good players or lesser skilled players. They're just humans. And then we all have the same concerns and the same questions and the same aspirations, or certainly typically we do, which is to kind of get better at what we do, whether you're a recreational player at the weekend or a guy who's aspiring to be a major champion. We all have aspirations to a level. My role is it goes back to that Sherpa approach. It's kind of, let's help you climb Everest. You'll define what Everest is to you. Everest might be winning the club medal, and then wonderful, what a great achievement.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful way to sort of wrap up. Just before we do finally wrap up, I'll just ask you these rapid fire questions and then the action challenge, which I know you prepared for the listeners. So if you had sort of $100, if a golfer shouldn't had $100 to spend money on, what would you best way they could get value for money out of that?
Yeah, I have a device called a posture belt, which was designed and devised by a very good friend of mine called Ramsey McMaster, physiotherapist in Australia. So the posture belts, I think, not only from an anatomical point of view, but also movement base and a concept base and a skill refinement, the belts allow you to explore and achieve so much. So if you had to buy one thing, the Ramsey posture belts are just the best.
And what can you give? What that allows a golfer to do or feel?
So it kind of goes back to the two things you said earlier in the discussion. In terms of helping establish good posture and good frame and good awareness, but also connecting it back to how they move in golf. So it's a belt device that you wear that also really helps them train, helps them move, helps their concepts of how they move and swing. Still the best device I've ever used. So if anyone wants to go online and type in Ramsey McMaster posture belt, it really would be the best $100 you could spend.
I will find it and I'll put it in the show notes for everyone.
They are just the best.
Okay.
Ramsey unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but it kind of shows how good the belt is that 5 years on, nothing's been designed which has ever replaced it still. So that's a real sign of a good design, that it's timeless to a level.
Fantastic. I will find it and make sure everyone gets to see that. The most gifted or read book?
Golf or non-golf?
Can say one golf and say one non-golf.
Non-golf would be my favourite book of all time is a book called Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. That will make you think. In terms of some kind of
natural stoicism.
Yeah, I was going to say, a kind of stoic way to life. So that's, Aurelius for me is just a wonderful book to read. Golf book, it's not directly golf, but it's hugely connected to golf. I actually really enjoyed The Talent Code way back when. I know it's a well-read book by many people, but it's a wonderful book just to kind of look at how successful people became successful. So it's a book called The Talent Code I thought was very, very good. But they would certainly be probably my two favourite kind of reads to go and...
Talent
but I'd
Code.
say the most guy, go write your own book, become your own story, and write it yourself. And
why'd you say that?
Because it kind of goes back to why become someone else's value. Get very good at being you again. So make your own autobiography as far as rather than trying to read someone else's.
That's great. No, I love it. A quote that you live by, or sort of that you want to put on your arm, but you quite haven't yet.
I think I just said it. Be the best at being you is my favourite thing on the planet. That be as authentic, be as organic, be a pain, but in a very, very friendly, pleasant, enjoyable way. Ask 1,000 questions, make a few movements, and just to maybe explore that two things that really reveal in sessions are that whenever I give someone a stimulus or give someone a command to play with, it really reveals two things: their learning history and their movement history. So I'm very, very big on that. Whenever I have a discussion, it really exposes those past, the learning you've been exposed to and the movements that you haven't done or have done. So just become the very, very best at being you.
Fantastic. That's very inspiring. And last of all, the action challenge. Each week we get our guest for an action challenge, which is something the listeners can try and implement a drill exercise, which is something which you believe in yourself. So fire away.
Yeah, find a brick wall and learn to stand straight against it. I mean, it's still, you find out how good your builders are when your brick walls are level by doing this drill. But, find a brick wall, and can you stand on the wall with your pelvis, your shoulder blades and the back of your neck without adapting or extending your neck, and apply equal pressure through back of the pelvis, back of the ribcage, shoulder blades, again, without adapting or extending the head and the neck and the back of the head, and just look to establish and maintain that wonderful spine and posture that mum and dad were very lucky enough to give us way back when. So brick walls and standing well, still the best things to use.
And should it be flat all the way back from the top of your head all the way down, or should there be actually some bits, so the lower part of your back should be off? Or?
Absolutely right. That's why it's kind of very clear to say that the three reference points are the back of your pelvis, the back of your behind, your kind of the apex of your thoracic spine, so between your shoulder blades and almost the back of your eye sockets. Those are the three reference points that really touch the wall. There'll be spaces elsewhere, but if you can apply equal pressure through those three areas, it's normally it's a crude reflection, but it's a fairly accurate reflection that posturally things are in a pretty good place.
Fantastic. And to wrap up, where can people find you if they want to reach out to you or follow you online? Websites?
My web address is just my name, ball3d.co.uk. My Twitter address is markball3d. So you'll normally find me in one of those two places.
Fantastic.
Or you'll normally find me somewhere moving around and asking many, many questions and annoying people in a good way.
In a good way.
Moving somewhere or asking questions. That's kind of, like I said, sit down and be quiet, or move and ask questions. It really is your choice.
And the club you're related to in England?
Yeah, so my base, we're very lucky. We have a wonderful facility at Reigate Hill. I'm attached to Reigate Hill Golf Club with two of my very close friends and colleagues, Hugh Mart and Matt Antel. So Hugh, Matt and myself are based at Reigate Hill, which is just off of Junction 8 on the M25.
Fantastic. And for all of the listeners that are listening on this, if you do have a chance to go and see Mark, I happened to watch an episode, and I'm probably going to have to come and see you at some point, because I was thoroughly impressed by your method of teaching, and just how you were able to communicate to the student and for them to teach themselves, and just how simple it was and how specific it was of what you were trying to achieve with them. And it was just a pleasure to see it. And I said I may have to book in with you in a couple of months. So
well, I'm very big on, Chris, players make me look good. So that's I learned that a long time ago. So I'm only as good as the human in front of me. So
well, I'm sure
you're very kind,
very equally impressed with you. So well, thank you so much for this, and thank you for taking time out of your day to reveal sort of all these gems and philosophies. It's absolutely fantastic.
My absolute pleasure.
Fantastic. Okay, take care, Mark.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks
Bye-bye.
again. Goodbye. Bye.
Thanks again for listening to Making a Club Champion podcast. If you love the show, don't forget to leave a review. If you want to take immediate action on what you just learned, head over to www.makingaclubchampion.com, where you'll receive your own personal action challenges from the latest guests, all of the show notes, strategic philosophies, and much, much more. If you want even more from the show, head over to Instagram at Making a Club Champion, where you'll receive lots of golden nuggets and gems and goodies. Until next time, thanks for listening.